I built this TM EN300 TBI last week, and this week I snuck out for a few hours to ride it. Here's what I thought of the bike. Right off the bat, I felt that this bike was quite unique. Both the engine and the chassis feel different than any other bike I've ever ridden before. Now that shouldn't be too surprising given the options available, since the Japanese don't actually make a bike that fits properly into the enduro category. That pretty much leaves Sherco, Beta, and the red, white, and orange KTMs. This bike is truly unique. Differences in the engine, suspension, and the chassis all jumped out at me as soon as we turned onto the trail. There's a short section of road to ride before we get into the trail, and I immediately noticed the powerful mid-range that the bike has. The front wheel happily comes up at any time, but the bottom end did feel a little lazy. I wasn't sure how it would do on technical sections where low-end throttle response is so crucial, but it didn't take too long to find out. The entrance to the trail network is a winding uphill that continues on for at least a kilometer. The bottom end power is definitely not as strong as the other 300s on the market, but the dead zone is quite small. The bike isn't hard to keep in the mid-range at all. With a little bit of clutch work, I was able to work my way up the hill quite easily. I was worried about how aggressive the engine would be in tight trails, but it was surprisingly manageable. I didn't struggle to rein it in at all, and it pulled me over logs and rocks and other technical obstacles very smoothly. Once I was able to open it up a bit more, the engine really came to life. This bike loves to be ridden hard. If you can ride it aggressively enough, I have no doubt that this bike is faster than any other production bike on the market. Of course, I'll be testing this, but I feel like expert and pro level GNCC style riders will enjoy this engine a lot. Now, any bike that I spend a lot of time on will be subject to some tuning, and after riding it for a couple hours, I think if I could change the engine at all, I would just take some of that mid-range power and pull it on down to the bottom to create a more linear curve. I'm not saying that TM should be doing that, it's just my personal preference. As I mentioned, I'm planning on giving this bike to some more aggressive riders to get their opinions on it as well. Now, most of the time when I ride a bike with an aggressive motor, I tense up when I see roots coming. I thought the suspension on the TM would be much harsher than it actually is. My personal bike is plusher than the TM, but the TM is not at all harsh. It walks that fine line between plushness and handling. I noticed immediately that the front end felt light, but not skittish. It's plush, but not wallowy. It absorbs bigger impacts smoothly as well. The closed chamber KYBs are naturally not quite as compliant feeling as my open chamber setup, but again, most intermediate to expert level riders are going to prefer a fork that maintains its composure when subjected to some compression forces. The rear end felt really nice as well. It didn't bounce around, but I was still able to feel what the rear end was doing. I generally like to run my springs on the soft side to settle the bike a little bit more, but the TM tracked well and allowed me to stay on the throttle while changing directions on hills. I was surprised how well the rear end held traction on logs, rocks, and steep uphills despite my lazy technique. I feel like TM has done an excellent job with setting up the suspension for their aluminum chassis. During this first ride, we brought out my 2006 YZ project as well. I've valved and sprung it, and it has very similar KYBs to the TM and also has an aluminum frame. I feel like the chassis on the YZ is too rigid, and I wondered if the TM would feel that way too. The TM definitely feels more rigid than my steel frame TPI, but not as rigid as my YZ. The TM isn't even broken in yet, and it's clear that it would have that comfy leather shoe type feel pretty quickly. The transition from the seat to the tank might be the best I've ever felt. It feels like there is no transition. Moving back and forth on the bike feels natural, and the bike feels very narrow and light. The chassis reminds me a little bit of a 125. It's really easy to throw into corners, and it stands up quickly. I can easily raise the front end on the exit of a corner and relocate it. After installing the handlebars, I didn't feel like moving them at all, which is quite rare for me. I often struggle because I like my bars slightly rolled back from neutral, but since I'm tall, I like a long feeling cockpit for upper body stability. The TM felt comfortable right away. Now, of course, as a mechanic and a rider, I can't just jump onto a bike and not want to change anything. There are definitely a few things I will be addressing before my next ride, which hopefully will be in the next week or so. And number one on that list is the rear brake pedal. all three of us riders struggled with it. The middle section of the pedal bends out quite a ways from the clutch cover, and I found that I was constantly stepping on the arm instead of the tip. This forced me to move my foot toward the outside of the peg to modulate the brake properly on downhills or through corners. It's not a big deal though. I'm planning on heating and bending it a little. I also don't like big brake tips. We'll see if I can come up with an easy solution for that. I have big feet and they catch on pedals that stick out too far. Number 2 is the shifter. This isn't really a complaint at all, but I like to cut a ½ inch off my shifter to, again, allow me to move my feet around a little more without catching on it. Number 3 is that ridiculous kill button. I don't think I'm going to have this bike for long enough to go to the trouble of rewiring the left-hand switch cluster, but if I owned the bike, that would be the first thing on my list. There were half a dozen situations on the first ride alone where I wasn't able to kill the bike quickly because my finger was busy with the clutch. Number 4, and probably the biggest concern, is the bottom end burble. Most of the time it really wasn't any hindrance, but a couple of times I noticed it, and 2 times during the ride the bike bogged out while on a slow uphill and it actually stalled. I have already received messages that there is aftermarket mapping available for this bike that addresses the fuel mapping and the power valve tuning as well. I haven't confirmed that, but the TM crowd seems like a pretty enthusiastic bunch, which is always nice. Information travels quickly in a tight-knit group like that. The distributor let me know that a fan kit, rad guards, and a skid plate are on the way for this bike, and I hope to have the time to soon install those bits. This was my first experience ever on a TM, and so far I'm very impressed and I'm enjoying the bike a lot. If you're interested in hearing what I have to say after riding it some more and doing some work on the bike, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and if you liked the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. If you want to see what I'm working on in a more real-time way, feel free to follow me on Instagram. Thanks a lot for watching.